Iran's president falls out of the sky. Now, Glenn, I know you've been following this. What happened? Did he fly too close to the sun, like Icarus?
Well, he might have been a victim of incompetent mechanics. That seems to be the case,
or a pilot flying in inclement weather, in weather they should not have been flying.
Well, that's also competence. Sure. I mean, you have to know when to dare and when to be prudent. It seems to have been there's no indication. Tasteless witticisms or attempts thereof aside, there's no indication of foul play at all here. It's a combination of a bad decision by pilot, of bad weather, difficulty of maintaining 1960s era helicopter due to fundamentally American but international sanctions, and I think the probable incompetence and corruption of the Revolutionary Guard Corps and the military that maintained the helicopter. But the fact is that President Ebrahim Raisi and the foreign minister of Iran were killed in a crash. And I'm not gloating at all. This is a significant event because Raisi, by all assessments, was the likely successor to the Ayatollah Khamenei, the current spiritual leader and the true leader of Iran. And I just wrote a piece, a cover story in Newsweek in Japan on this, and the title I gave it is "Even Worse." From my perspective, and the perspective of probably all of us listening, from a Western perspective, or those who value individual and human rights, Raisi was terrible. He was ruthless.
He was known as the hanging judge. I don't know how many thousands he sentenced to hanging.
Over 5,000 people in 1979 alone.
Yeah,
he condemned to death.
Gary, our colleague, Gary Grappo, our former chair, Fair Observer, we've recorded a piece with Gary that you can see on video and read the summary, which will give you much more context. So Raisi wasn't exactly an attractive character. He was seen, however, as someone who was loyal to the revolution, someone who knew Islamic law, someone who deserved to be Ayatollah. And now pretty much Iran's succession is up in the air, and the Ayatollah is only in his youthful 80s and apparently is doddering away to meet Allah.
And one of the excruciating ironies of Iranian political life is that Raisi, ruthless, murderous, conservative, rigid as he was a bulwark against the situation in Iran and internationally becoming even worse. I'll explain why, but what can we anticipate? With Raisi's death?
I'll interject very briefly. That's because the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, has increasingly taken charge. It's the Praetorian Guard of the revolution, and it wants a more aggressive policy in the Middle East. It sees the current situation as a historic opportunity, and it is also smarting under the loss of some of its key leaders, whom Israel has eliminated. So there are wheels within wheels. And Raisi, who was the hanging judge in 1979, was the old wise man who was holding back the young Turks, so to speak. I'm sure Iranians would be delighted at the analogy.
Yes, well, which I was. Yes, you actually made me laugh. It's very witty. So the next Iranian president, and we don't know who it will be, but it doesn't really matter given the parameters that will limit the selection and make the selection likely, is likely to enforce an even stricter interpretation of the Quran and of the Shia regime's policies than Raisi did. Whoever succeeds him is also likely to continue, almost certain to continue, the fundamental Iranian policies of death to Israel and death to America. These are the slogans they like to chant as they go about burning the American flag. It's probably going to take the regime increasingly aggressive actions to those that have already been more aggressive than in recent years in the Middle East through Iran's surrogates, Hamas, although that is not Shia or an organization, Hezbollah, the Houthi in Yemen and now beyond, and various other Shia groups in Iraq and Syria and elsewhere. So that bodes poorly internationally.
Yeah. Just to interject, Hezbollah are the closest proxy to Iran because Hezbollah are dyed-in-wool Shia. Iran has had access to them through Syria, and remember
and created them.
Yeah, created them. And remember that Syria is also ruled by Shia, a minority Alawite community. The Assad family comes from the minority Alawite sect, which is nominally Shia, if not strictly Shia. And Hezbollah is almost seen as an extension of the Iranian state in terms of foreign policy. Also, Hezbollah is the only existing institution in Lebanon. Government cannot collect the rubbish. The central bank's governor runs off with the cash. I mean, it's a completely corrupt, dysfunctional, divided state. So Hezbollah is really powerful. When you come south, the Houthis are also Shia, but they are more loosely aligned to Iran. They listen, but not always. And sometimes they do things on their own. They are far away, of course. And then Hamas is Sunni. And today they may be in the same boat as allies of convenience. But the Shia-Sunni schism means that tomorrow they could turn on each other just as easily. So Hamas is not exactly a proxy for Iran, but it's a useful tool. They are useful idiots for Iran.
Tool proxy. I mean, if they're doing things that create headaches for Iran's enemies, and in so doing also help extend Iranian influence, if only through disruption, then they're a tool of Iran, which they've been. And their funding and their weapons and some of their training has come, but a little in the weeds. So it's likely whoever succeeds Raisi will expand these activities. So the tensions are likely to increase, if anything, throughout the region as a result of the helicopter crash in the Dismar Forest near the Iranian Azerbaijani border. Worse, possibly still, or even still, is that the successor is also probably going to, it will become more likely still that Iran will at last actually manufacture a nuclear weapon. And this is because, why all of these things? Because the next generation of leaders, as Atul alluded to, perversely is more conservative, more aggressive, more anti-Western, more anti-US than the current one, my age, my generation, as was Raisi, that came to power with and after the 1979 Iranian Revolution, and are now fading from the scene because they all have gray hair and are going off to Allah, as I'll go off someplace.
Allah won't take you.
No, you would not take me. That is for certain. Hezbollah would take me, however. So the likely leaders, those who have the guns and hold the power in Iran, are, as I said, more conservative and more hostile. The vast majority of the Iranian population is hostile to them and is pro-Western and aspires broadly to the ideals of the Age of Enlightenment. But if you don't have the guns, then you are going to lose, and that's what has happened.
One thing to point out, Glenn, is that for all its perversity, the Islamic Republic did manage to deliver universal literacy. Unlike the Shah, who was effete, corrupt, extravagant, he spent, God knows, 700, 800 million in his fancy party at Persepolis. And so unlike the Shah, the mullahs have managed to deliver universal literacy. Now, it has come back to bite them because the women who are now all literate, and Iranian women tend to perform better than men at the university level. The Iranian women are really chafing against the tight fist, the iron fist of the mullahs. And
well, it's not just Iranian women; it's females everywhere and anywhere. But that's a whole other subject.
Especially in Iran, because
that's literally true.
Because they have a morality police. Especially in Iran, the rifts are very deep.
Yeah, I'll grant the point on education, but that to me also is like the regular claims of the lovers of the Cuban Revolution of Fidel Castro that their healthcare system is wonderful and therefore the revolution is fine. And I don't really go
the revolution
that far
isn't fine. I
at
didn't
all.
make that point, but I'm saying that we have to understand.
No, you didn't.
We have to understand that why the revolution happened. But we are getting into the weeds. The key thing is that the population.
So I think Iran domestically, as a result, is going to be more oppressive. And the concluding point and the fundamental power is the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. As you said, they're the Praetorian Guards. They are the king or the Shah makers, the Ayatollah makers. They've had the power and progressively take more of it. And the only two centers, or there are three, I guess, that back the throne of the Ayatollah is the IRGC, which has the guns, the Basiji, the local merchants who have throughout Iran who have profited from the regime because the regime has sort of bought them off and facilitated their lives.
Given them contracts, given them all sorts of favors like land permits, etc.
And conservative clerics, while 90%, 80% of the Iranian public is profoundly not just hostile to, but appalled by and opposed to the regime. So domestically, the consequences are likely to be dark for Iran, but internationally too, as I touched upon. Now, Raisi, in some way, to his credit, he was successful and subtle. He pursued what he called resistance diplomacy, which is a politically chosen term to sound tough. But that meant I will be hostile to the West and the United States in particular, but let's negotiate a nuclear agreement again so that we can have sanctions lifted, economically will benefit, we can integrate to the West, address some of the desires of the Iranian people, take the pressure off the regime. And that was all undone, not by Iranian perfidy, but by the United States, by Donald Trump, who repudiated the nuclear agreement and imposed more sanctions. And then Raisi decided, well, what have I benefited from trying to make nice to the West? Everything's gone wrong and things are worse. So he then reinitiated the Iranian nuclear weapons program and is now much closer to having the regime to making a decision to build a nuclear weapon. 1, 2, and this is part of the strategic disaster of Trump's decision and the Republican policies of only hostility to Iran, which is they are now in an ever closer, they've repudiated attempting to reconcile with the United States in any way, and they are now in an ever closer strategic relationship with what? The two great powers on earth that are hostile to all Western norms in the United States, Russia and China. So, and this was frankly the United States doing. It's not certain what would have happened after Russia invaded Ukraine, but had the nuclear agreement continued and the U.S. and Iran far improved their relations, Iran would have had much more to lose by deciding to make a strategic alliance with Russia and China. So now what we have is a tenser world, a more bipolarly divided world, a more hostile Iran. The successor pool is so narrow that the IRGC is even progressively likely no longer to be the power behind the throne, but to occupy the throne. And all of this is far more likely, if not certain, as a result of the helicopter crash in the forest of northern Iran.
So one thing to note is that the helicopter crash is going to trigger elections. There's a caretaker president, there'll be elections for a new president. And of course, these elections are managed elections. You have to be approved as a candidate. And then you can run, and all the inconvenient candidates are weeded out. But the important thing to note is the succession to the Ayatollah himself is in question. Who will become the president is in question. And the knives are sharpening within Iran, within the elite, as to who will grab power. So, on the whole, Iran is internally in a very destabilized condition. And whenever you have such instability, there is always risk of someone power hungry waving the flag of patriotism, nationalism, Islamism, any ism, and creating a more hostile world. So more risks ahead.
Yeah, I'll close the Iranian part with a brief and literally verbatim true anecdote from my own career. Once, this is years and years ago, one of my intelligence operations was going seriously wrong. So that could be a career-ending disaster, personally as a professional, but more broadly, you don't want an intelligence operation to go wrong. At the same time, my personal life was collapsing. The two are probably related. And one of my superiors, possibly related, but probably not, was determined to destroy me. So this was not a good time at all. And a close colleague, a friend of mine who was a colleague, took me aside as all this was happening to talk. And I thought he was going to buck me up at a dark time. And so that made me feel I appreciated the gesture. And he said, "Glenn, do not worry. As bad as things are, they can always get worse." And so I laughed, but they did. They did get worse. And I fear that's the circumstance that we'll find ourselves confronting. We do find ourselves confronting in Iran and for all of us now as a result of Raisi's death. And we can pass then from the tense and fearful future there to
join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.